Hi, welcome back from lunch. What do you say we dig into transportation and CIPs?
I was hoping you'd say that.
You've been waiting for it all
Even all day.
Now you're gonna.
Careful what you wish for. I spread this a little too thick, am I?
Well, good afternoon, Chair Harrington, Commissioners. I am Rachel Fuller. I'm one of the Assistant County Administrators, and I'm here with Stephen Roberts, Director of Land Use and Transportation. Today, we're going to review where we are in our capital improvement plan process to launch the county's first ever comprehensive capital improvement plan, discuss how capital improvement planning fits into the organization's management framework and long-term financial planning, and then move into a discussion about transportation capital projects, specifically incorporating MSTIP into the CIP framework, and options for addressing significant cost escalation within transportation capital. Transportation is the focus today, but this capital improvement program truly is a One Washington County effort. As you can see by the people in the room, we have staff from facilities, IT, finance, all here in support of this effort.
There's a little slider switch on the side. Yeah.
It's stuck.
Oh, there we go. Okay. As you know, capital improvement planning is a standard business practice for understanding, planning, and funding capital needs in a community. The county is building its first ever countywide capital improvement plan, which will provide the board with a comprehensive picture of needed capital projects and associated funding. Your board approved an initial plan in June, which was essentially an inventory of known capital projects. And with several work sessions this fall, we're taking the next step in the process to begin project prioritization conversations and conversations about funding. So a few quick definitions. A capital improvement plan combines the needs with financial decisions to meet those needs. Year one of a capital improvement plan will become the capital budget for the upcoming year, and years 2 through 5 are intended as planning years to provide a comprehensive picture of those near-term capital needs. The plan includes a clear estimate of all major components of the projects, including land acquisition, design, construction, and contingency. Capital improvement program is the work that has to happen to implement the plan. We don't have a comprehensive capital improvement program at the county, but elements of the program exist in various forms throughout the various departments. Capital improvement programs include the framework for managing capital needs, including consideration for fiscal capacity, plans for debt issuance, and for assuring that capital project priorities are consistent with overall organizational goals. Just a few examples of program components that we will be developing over the next couple of years. A description of how we're going to go about capital improvement planning on an annual basis. Consideration for significant capital maintenance projects. Provisions for monitoring and oversight of the CIP program, including reporting requirements and how to handle changes. And these will not happen overnight, but these are important first steps that we're taking. So finally, a capital improvement project is the actual project to be delivered and built in the community. This includes the seismic upgrade of the PSB or transportation improvements to 198. This is very high level how capital improvement planning fits into our management system. Department-specific plans, such as land use community plans, the transportation system plan, the recently commissioned facilities condition index, and the IT services roadmaps all serve to inform the capital improvement plan. Situated here, you can see how it's important to ensure that the capital improvement plan is consistent with overall organizational goals and efforts. We've talked about why the board is engaging and staff are engaging in this process, but in summary, infrastructure, technology, facilities, and major equipment are the physical foundation of providing services to our community. And the purpose of bringing everything together into one plan is to coordinate long-term planning for infrastructure needs. As we said before, capital improvement planning is a best practice in local government and demonstrates sound financial management and benefit to the public within resource constraints. The procurement, design, and construction of these projects require significant expenditure of funds and careful planning and prioritization. The annual process, as we get into the CIP annual process, will allow the board to respond to changing circumstances, such as the significant cost increases that we've seen in recent years. This graphic shows the on-ramp to the new capital improvement planning model. This shows how we will move into the new model over time and then how it becomes an iterative annual process. As we talked about, there are significant policy decisions for the board as part of the initial planning effort, and that will take some time to work through. And then over time, this will become part of the regular process. This graphic shows generally where each department is in the process. Initial planning involved reviewing plans, inventorying assets, identifying needs, and creating that initial plan. The next steps and where we'll be for the next several months are to begin discussions about prioritization, funding, and financing, and the development of policies to guide the process. So with that, I will turn it over to Stephen to talk about transportation and MSTIP specifically, and how we're incorporating this program into the countywide CIP process.
All right, good afternoon, commissioners. Jump right in here. So as we're talking about transportation today, we'll walk through these basic topics here. So again, a little bit about the why we're rolling this, our legacy transportation capital project process into the CIP. We've been doing capital planning, as Rachel was alluding to. We've just done it in a different way. We've typically taken a funding-based approach and said, okay, we've got X amount of dollars from this funding source. What are our priorities for that funding source? And we've had multiple funding sources, MSTIP, Urban Road Maintenance District, are a couple that come to mind. So really just stepping back and just at the transportation level, as Rachel was saying, at the county-wide level, we're trying to take a more holistic look at how we plan for all of these different needs. Essentially establishing priorities, then establishing how to fund and finance those. So we want to build on the good work that our staff and our community partners did as we were considering an upcoming round of future projects, what we were calling MSTIP 23 to 28. And we want to start thinking about how we roll some additional projects in while we're also working through a list of prior projects that we're also working to close a funding gap for. Talk a little bit about those funding challenges, and then we'll talk a little bit about next steps. So this is a little bit redundant with what Rachel was just saying, but again, I think it just is a good reminder why we're doing this. It really gives you, as the decision makers, the opportunity to look at these transportation needs holistically, and then alongside other capital needs across the county and other priorities. So it gives us the opportunity, by having an annual review process, gives us the ability to be flexible. We know that there are things that change along the way, and so we need to be flexible and make adjustments as needed. And then again, we want to just stress we have real opportunities to advance equity in the community, and that's a fundamental tenet of the work that we're doing. So making sure that we're helping in the transportation realm, how do we help improve access for people to the places that they need to get to be. And then we also have a fairly significant spending rate in that program. So how do we advance equitable contracting and procurement practices going forward so that we're putting those county funds to the best possible use to generate good outcomes for our community? So there's a lot of good stuff about the work that we've been doing, and I'm thinking specifically here about MSTIP. We have really strong partnerships with our cities in the county. We work well with other entities, the Park District and ODOT and other agencies, Metro. So we want to continue, obviously, those relationships. We want to continue that focus on the major streets, that countywide network, the backbone that helps get people across the county into the places, again, they need to go throughout the county. We want to obviously continue doing robust community engagement, making sure that we're providing the board and our other decision makers good information to base your decisions on. And we like the idea of the 5-year project selection cycle. It's a pretty significant undertaking to go out and develop these lists of priorities. And so having that, roughly 5-year spacing to do that work seems to work pretty well. And then we'll talk more about this, but it's also helpful for us in terms of just managing the program in terms of finances and staffing and those sorts of things going forward. We also have some opportunities here that we want to look at too. So again, we have the advantage of implementing an annual review process so we can check back in and make sure that things are on schedule. We can accommodate and discuss with you needed changes based on project scopes, schedules, budget, etc. We may have some opportunities here again to explore some other changes. Some of those might include things like a city share requirement, sort of using the model that we implemented with our MSTIP bonding cost sharing program, so that benefits of that are it helps to leverage county funding. And in the event that we have cost escalation, which we've certainly been seeing lots of, we share that financial exposure and risk, if you will, with our partner agencies too. And again, just advancing equity, just can't say that enough. So this graphic was helpful for me, and I think hope will be helpful for you. So we're sort of thinking about how to talk way through this process and looking at the various inputs into our transportation, specifically capital improvement planning work, and then moving that forward into an implementable plan. So we're also thinking that these 3 steps here, 1, 2, and 3, happen somewhat sequentially because the inputs and the decisions and direction that we get perhaps at that first step will certainly influence what happens in steps 2 and 3. But I also want to be clear that these are somewhat iterative processes. So we might say, okay, well, what if we do this in step 1? What does that mean for step 2 and 3? And then we back up and go back and forth. But that seems to be a fairly logical progression through there. So the first step is we have a list of projects that we have identified a funding gap for. So we're working on how to address that funding gap and keep projects moving forward there. We also need to start bringing in some additional projects for keeping our project pipeline moving along into the future. So we'll come back and talk more about that. And then in the MSTIP program, we've had some programmatic allocations, and I think in particular about the Opportunity Fund, which has really been very successful in helping to leverage 5-to-1, 6-to-1, 7-to-1 external funding that we're bringing from outside Washington County, using some local matching funds to be able to do that work. So we're anxious to continue those programs, especially the ones that help us to leverage other funding. So I mentioned the project pipeline, and so that ability to have sort of that 5-year big look at project priorities is really helpful. That helps us, again, to just ensure that our pipeline is sort of known and stable, and that we can keep the program moving forward as efficiently and effectively as we can. We know that our projects take anywhere from 2 to 10 years or more in some cases for a whole variety of reasons, but they're not single-year projects. They don't all get done in a 5-year cycle, but charting that next set of priorities for the upcoming, say, 5 years or so is very helpful. We've talked about the financing. It also is helpful for managing, of course, finance and funding as we go through. And so we're just continuing, we're recommending that we continue that sort of 5-year big look process, as I mentioned earlier. I hope this is helpful to you. This was helpful to me too. Just sort of thinking about, as you look at an individual project, that curve is sort of depicting an approximate spending rate that you might see with a particular project as it moves through the project delivery pipeline. So in the early stage, we're in that sort of preliminary design process. We have a relatively low spending rate. We move into the final design and start acquiring right-of-way and easements. And so the cost, the spending rate, if you will, goes up. Then we move into construction. And so you get to a point where you have a pretty significant spend because you're actually building at that point. And then of course that starts to taper off as you start to complete that project. So you see the bold line is a particular project, and then you'll see some faint lines in the background there. And the idea is that as you're trying to more, fairly efficiently and effectively manage that project, the program, you've got multiple projects that are in various stages throughout that process. This slide is a depiction of our current list of projects that we're working on and the stages that they're in right now. You've seen a variation of this before. What it shows you here is that we have projects that are in those 3 different stages that we talked about: design, right-of-way and permitting, and then construction. On the right, it's fairly small print, but you can sort of see a little bit about who the folks are that are doing the work at the different stages in the process. So obviously we have county staff, but we have city partner staff engaged with us in this work. We rely on outside contractors and consultants to do a lot of the design work and certainly the construction work with us. And that's always been one of the strong points of the program, is that we are actually reinvesting a lot of county funds back into our local economy through those consultants and contractors. So one of the key takeaways here is that you can see that we have a whole lot of projects that are largely completed probably by fiscal year 25-26. Again, that's all contingent on ensuring that we have adequate funds to move those all through the construction pipeline. But so again, this sort of highlights that we are looking to bring some additional projects into the delivery pipeline now so that we can move them through design and then be ready to start building, hopefully in that 25-26, 26-27 timeframe. So going forward, obviously a program like this, it requires a predictable workload and revenue. So back to the idea of the pipeline and how we manage that project pipeline. As we're going through this work, we have been and continue to explore different funding options. So those may include continuing a general fund transfer for transportation purposes, bonding for some funds. Of course, if you borrow, you have to have a repayment source when you do that. We're actively seeking grants, but I think I've shared with you before, those grant programs are heavily oversubscribed and extremely competitive. So we've not had a lot of success with securing grants for some of the projects that we have put forward, but we'll continue trying. And then obviously just thinking about other potential local, state, and federal funding sources. So again, the process that we're embarking on or are in right now, moving into the CIP, just gives us opportunities to explore all of those things. So as I mentioned earlier, we really want to roll forward the good work that we did and with our city partners and our community partners, and use that as the starting point for identifying what the next grouping of projects may be that we want to prioritize to try to move into that pipeline. And as we went through that process last year, we did a series of cost estimating, and we did some construction risk assessments that we'll need to update, of course, because we continue to learn more about actual costs. They just continue creeping up. And we had a list of 25 potential projects that we were planning to bring back to both the WCCC for their input and recommendation, eventually to bring forward to the board for a final decision. We paused that work. We had to step back and assess the funding needs for those existing projects that we have on our list. And then we also needed to develop our initial CIP that Rachel mentioned earlier, sort of the project inventory, and get that work done and get that adopted to build a foundation for the work that we're continuing to do now. We were really pleased with the community engagement that we did from the MISTIP 23-28 process. We really advanced our equity focused outreach in this last round, and I think it gives us good good work that we can continue to build on in the future. We did a lot of work in partnership with OEICE, really thinking about how to equitably engage the community and make sure that we were hearing from as broad a group of folks as we could. And we also partnered with the Spousal Strategies, John L. Bell and his team, to really help us think through that work. And so again, we want to build on that good work that's been done. And then based on this idea that, say, every 5 years we would be doing a big look, we would go out for another significant round of community engagement around transportation system priorities and project priorities, probably in the 2028 timeframe, so that we would be setting ourselves up for discussions about projects to deliver in the 2030s. So this slide shows above the blue line or that same list of projects that you saw a little bit earlier that are in the process now. And then below the line, again, this is all very hypothetical and conceptual, but so showing the idea that we're trying to identify another series of project priorities that then move into the pipeline, and just thinking about how those align with each other over time. So before we jump into talking more about funding specifically, we thought this was a good opportunity. We've covered a lot already and just wanted to see if you have any questions or concerns or thoughts about what we've shared so far, and specifically on the bullet point topics that you see here before we moved on.
I think it would be useful to develop another graphic about the sequencing, because there's the current pipeline, and I understand, right, with the green, purple, and blue, but to bring in because there's a current set, right, and then to bring in that timing of the 5-year community engagement as set up for the next step. Yeah. So that, excuse me, people have a model, because I believe what you're saying is we have a replicable model,
right?
And we just need to keep using it and going from there.
That's a really good suggestion. Yeah.
Because what we had was a replicable model previously, and you were here and I wasn't during the Great Recession. You took steps to navigate through all of that, right? Because there were cost escalations then. And now we've had this cost escalation, but also the disruption of construction projects with COVID as well, and the economic situation. So you do a really good job of adjusting. And I'm really proud of what you've done and stand by these models.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I find these graphics to be super helpful, just illustrating some of these concepts and how they work. Yeah.
Yeah. So for example, if we were to get a question, well, a couple of years ago, you made this big push around community engagement and equity. Why have you dropped that? Well, we haven't dropped that. Here's how it fits in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay.
I guess I'm trying to
I almost thought I was ready to go.
Envision the CIP process first. And so understanding how the MSTIP process works, because I've been involved in that for a long time. So are we going to be, and that platform is all the cities, everybody comes together and says, these are projects that we want to get in the queue. Okay. And then we begin to prioritize those and get them done. We're taking the 23-28 MSTIP money and kind of pushing it backwards because you need to backfill projects that are underwater. Is that correct?
Yeah, in some sense, yeah.
Where we're going.
And
can we go back to slide 12?
Of course.
Because I think that's what you're referring to, right? This cycle.
I was almost wondering.
It wasn't real clear to me that that's what that slide was saying, but that's why I'm asking for clarification.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Commissioner, I think maybe if not specifically related to a CIP, but we've had an MSTIP process that sort of followed a similar cycle, and I think that might be what the chair was suggesting was something that
Yeah,
kind of
we're
illustrates.
trying to build that first comprehensive CIP, right? Or the initial CIP with transportation. So we have to gather up, step one is gathering up the current MSTIP stuff. You mentioned that. And there's the initial project list from 28, 20, 23, 20, which we haven't
Right.
assessed yet, but they have new costs for. And so they need to put that back into that WCCC prioritization to make a recommendation to us. And then once we have that, then we'll be able to have that first ever full set of MSTIP into a CIP.
Right, which will include other funding sources, of course, too, right?
Yeah.
Well, I guess where I was going was going back to the first part of what your presentation, Rachel, was. So we have, as we've discovered, we've got some pretty significant deferred maintenance issues. And so is it those kinds of projects on the bricks and mortar side of things? Is it those kind of projects that we're going to compile, put together, and then begin to look further out on maintenance projects that, okay, in 10 years, this building needs a roof, or we got to replace the HVAC here, or we got to build a new courthouse? I mean, where does all of that get compiled and then begin to get prioritized, probably based more on demand rather than what we'd prefer to do, but you know, the roof's going to fall in, so we better fix that. And so we don't incur any more surprise jail, $38 million, $40 million issues. So is that, am I tracking with you on how you're going to build these two things going forward?
Yes, Commissioner, thank you for the question. We are building that comprehensive look so that on an annual basis, you will see not just what's happening in transportation, but what the needs are in facilities, either future needs or maintenance needs that are significant, and also what's happening in IT, so ERP. So we're really building that comprehensive look so that you can look at everything together and make those prioritizations.
At least it's an eyes wide open.
Eyes wide open.
So yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. I get it.
This is where I love these graphics.
Right. And a word I had.
Here's the big kahuna. Here's everything. Now here's the transportation part, right? And there's the facilities part, and there's the IT part.
Yeah, I was just thinking a word I had in my notes that I forgot to use earlier, I think was holistic. I mean, I think that's really the objective, is that you have a holistic look at all of these various needs in one place, as opposed to currently having to go hunt and peck for lots of different pieces of information.
Holistic. I need to use that.
All right, thank you. Any final thoughts before we move on? We still have a lot to cover.
Going.
Okay. You guys are doing great. Thank you. Okay, so here's the Band-Aid part, ripping off the Band-Aid. So when we were here last to talk about this in February, specifically about transportation, we were estimating that we had about a $70 million gap in that cost to complete our outstanding projects that are in the MISTIP 3D and 3E lists. So we bid a couple of additional projects late spring, and guess what? Costs were even higher than we had assumed based on escalating our project estimates. And so based on that new information, we went back on a couple of occasions actually and reviewed our project costs again for those outstanding projects. So that $70 million gap we're now estimating is about $90 million. And
So we went from 48 million plus 70 million to now 90 million.
right.
We're still in the millions.
Well, we didn't want to be outdone by facilities. So
Too soon, Stephen.
Ooh, we had a competition going there.
Sam?
Yeah.
No, it's not a competition. It's okay.
Yeah.
Our security posture is strong. I will say that.
I kid.
Together.
We absolutely
That's
are.
right. Chill.
We absolutely are. I kid. So yeah, so we have a significant challenge, and I think a good reminder here too. I was just asked the question again recently about what was the impact of the county's general fund budget reduction this year, and it was $3.5 million into the MSTIP program. And so again, in terms of order of magnitude, that's a very small element of the larger challenge that we're facing in terms of just completing those prior projects.
And that's construction costs. Is that,
Well, it's really the full cost to complete. And so,
but where's the lump? Is there a lumpy part of that?
well, construction is obviously the big spend, as you saw right earlier, right? So we have a number of, we'd actually built up a fairly sizable fund balance over time because we had a number of projects that for a whole variety of reasons had been sort of stacked up, and a number of them went to construction at about the same time. So we have a lot of big projects that are underway right now, and we're in a pretty significant spend down mode right now. And again, this is sort of, the difference in the initial cost that we thought it would take to, and when I say a fully loaded cost, that means like the full cost of the staff time associated with overseeing and managing the design, construction, and right of way, and the construction costs and all the other associated costs.
Kudos to all of you in the team for taking the time, for doing the pause, doing a visit, doing a revisit in order for us to feel really grounded. Next slide.
Yeah, and it's taken longer than I would have hoped, but here we are. We're doing.
So let me ask one quick question: was there a process where you went back to those projects that were significantly costing more and said, is there any place we can pare down,
Yes.
modify?
Yeah, we'll come.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about
All right.
that on the next slide, I think. Great question. So maybe the next slide. So there are a number of contributing factors. You've heard this before. There's just really unprecedented cost escalation. We certainly in my career, I've never seen anything like this. And we have assumed typically a 5 to 8% per year cost escalation over time. And what we've been seeing is like 30+%. So, and again, it's not just the county and it's not just transportation. It's really all aspects of public works. Projects are just costing significantly more than initial estimates. So we're all kind of in the same process of just sort of adjusting and figuring out how we move forward. So yes, we are making project scope changes, looking at some of our design decisions to try to see where we may be able to reduce some costs. There are just unforeseen project costs. I mentioned one of the projects earlier that was 10 years from allocation to construction, and that was hung up in transportation plan amendments and lawsuits and lengthy property negotiations and condemnation proceedings. And so, and then that project, actually, we slowed down a little bit to help Willamette Water Supply catch up so that we could partner with them and jointly build that project. So there are just things that happen, and over time, costs go up. And we also acknowledge that we didn't do a great job estimating the last couple of rounds of projects. We really needed to have a more robust, articulate process for how we develop our cost estimates. And so we've done that with our MSTIP 2328 cost estimates, and we're building in more risk contingency and more cost escalation contingency as we do those estimates. And we're still in the process of refining those costs. So we'll be bringing those back to you at some point here in the next few months, but just needing to take a much more cautious approach. I think looking back at those last two lists of projects that we adopted, we just tried to do too much. And I think we just have to be honest with ourselves. There's a limit to what we can achieve with the funding that we're going to have. So again, we have been looking at project scope reductions. We're actually removing a bridge from a project. So we're essentially going to build a half project.
Okay. Can I pick on that word? the bridge still has to be built for a complete system.
Yes, that's
So I want to pick on the word removing.
right.
All we're doing is delaying.
That's correct.
We're not removing,
Right.
because the project end to end will never be complete without it.
Correct.
So that one really hit a hot button for me.
Mm,
Which
mhm.
project
What
is
bridge
this?
is this?
This is the
Century
Century Boulevard
Boulevard.
project.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
That was what I was
in
thinking.
Hillsborough. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. And I think what we're saying is we sort of,
Delayed.
uh,
We're delaying.
yes, right.
bridge.
That is
We've
the,
done this for centuries, where we cherry pick, we do the easiest stuff first. We always delay the bridge because it's the biggest ticket item. Okay, not a bad strategy,
right. But it
but
doesn't,
let's describe it correctly.
right. Yep.
We're delaying it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, and so you're right, the cost that doesn't go away. So we'll still have to figure out a path forward for how to deliver that project element. So, and yeah, so we have some projects that were allocated back in those 3D and 3E lists that haven't started construction yet. And so we're thinking that we may want to look at some of those projects, put them into the mix of projects that are considered for future funding, and just give the board the opportunity to essentially reevaluate some of those prior project priorities.
If I could put a finer point on that, removing the bridge.
Mm.
During my career in the 1980s, so 40 years ago, I worked for a company called Wang Laboratories,
Mhm.
and they wanted to expand on an industrial site. And in order to do so, they needed a bridge across the Merrimack River.
Hmm.
So they paid for a temporary bridge across the Merrimack River, 2 lanes,
Wow.
metal structure, might have been aluminum, but it wasn't steel. Guess what? Still there. Lots of cars and trucks going over it. Hasn't changed one bit. The temporary surface has been redone a few times. But 40 years later, so
No toll.
just joking. So
True.
we may be in a situation where put in a temporary bridge, but gosh darn it, there will eventually be a bridge.
Mhm.
So I'm not recommending a temporary bridge, but
Interesting idea.
that temporary bridge has always stuck in my head. And on the few occasions that I've had a chance to go back, which I have done earlier this year, it's still there.
And messes up the definition of temporary.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, we do things that we call interim, and they're probably going to be in place for 40, 50, 60 years.
So like an interim ACA? Just curious.
Or just give it 40 more years.
I'm sure we
Can
can
help us out.
negotiate.
And here you thought you had a big, heavy
know.
deliver a $90 million gap. I think we're way past that, Stephen.
Yeah, no, this is heavy stuff. You know, we got to just keep working through this. So a little levity goes a long way. So one of the things we're doing is we're looking at our county sponsored projects. So as we develop those project lists, we think about sometimes who's the sort of sponsoring agency. So we have projects that are sort of pet projects for a city or the county, or it's clearly within an unincorporated area. So sort of falls to the county, or it's in a city. So maybe they're a partner in that discussion.
I
So
like the county system hat and the county UUA hat as 2 separate hats.
Mhm. Yeah. And so for county projects, we are exploring options to use some transportation development tax funds to help fill some gaps. So bringing an additional revenue, county revenue source to help address some of those needs. We're having similar conversations with cities. Do they have TDT funds or other funding sources that they might be able to bring to bear to help close some of the funding gaps? As I mentioned earlier, grants, and then we'll be jumping into talking about some potential funding scenarios. So we're just wanting to outline some very conceptual and very preliminary scenarios just for discussion purposes. Your input and direction today, I think, will help us to refine those, and then we'll be bringing them back to you for further discussion. Okay, lots to chew on here. So let me try to explain what we were trying to achieve here. So these are 3 preliminary, as I said, sort of conceptual scenarios for ways to help address that existing gap. So again, for context, we're kind of in that step 1 part of that earlier chart with the 3 steps here. So we just came up with these 3 scenarios just for discussion purposes. There are the first 2 rows in the table that you see here are consistent assumptions that carry across, and the key assumptions, and we realize these are significant assumptions, are that there would continue to be some ongoing general fund transfer for transportation purposes, and that we would bond for the necessary funding to complete the bonding cost sharing project list. We did an initial bond sale in 2016. There was always a recognition that there would be a second bond sale needed at some point in the process. And so we're at that point of needing to do that second bond sale. Where the scenarios differ then is that 3rd row. And so what we've tried to do is just sort of think about a range of different approaches for how we fund the gap. So the first scenario is that we don't do any bonding in terms of just closing the gap for the 3D, 3E projects. We just use a combination of sort of rescoping and delaying or deferring projects to help make sure that we can work through that funding gap over time. So in other words, that continuing revenue coming in from an annual general fund transfer and or any other funding sources we're able to bring to bear would just continue to help us chip away at that gap.
The theme for those 3 boxes then under scenario 1 is still deliver the project list over a longer time period.
Right. Exactly.
So it's the variable of time.
Correct. Right.
You have time and you have money.
And it's sort of, it's really
reduce.
both vary a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The funding dictates the time, right? In this regard, I guess. And so an example for scenario 1 was we're assuming that we'll be looking for about a $60 million bond for the bonding cost sharing projects. And so that we just laying out very conceptually, maybe 2 $30 million bond issues over a period of 2 years.
And just to reiterate that the bonding timeframe, doing a bond, you have to be able to spend it out. Isn't the standard still over a 5 to 8 year time frame, Mr. Finance?
Bonds been down.
There is a statutory regulate.
As long as it's committed.
Yeah, I'm not aware of exact time.
You can't bond.
Covered 3.
You can't do a revenue or a project bonding over a 30-year time frame.
Can't spend, but you can commit.
Right.
It's different. I
You
think
can-
you're right, Kath, and I remember.
You can only do a sale for what you can.
We have to spend it in 5 years, even though we're financing it for however longer.
This
Right.
isn't a capital bond. This is a revenue bond we're talking about.
And sometimes, and I don't know if there are if we have internal policies about tying the repayment with the life of the asset. There's sometimes policies around those, but we can look at some of those internal policies and bring those forward.
Yeah. And I know
These
that.
aren't just internal policies. These are bonding covenant policies.
Right.
I've done capital bonds and revenue bonds. They're different.
Yep.
Yeah.
And my understanding when we did the initial bond sale in 2016 was we had a 3-year spend down expectation.
Yeah, our affordable housing bond. That's why we had to Metro had to let them out in multiple cycles.
Mhm.
It's because you can only bond to the degree that you can let projects out.
Yeah, and so obviously as we move forward with fleshing these scenarios out, I've already spoken with Mr. Mon. Obviously, we're going to need his support and assistance moving through this and coordinating with the county administrative office and thinking about how these various scenarios might be structured in a little bit more detail as we bring those back. So then in the second scenario, then that is what I would call a hybrid scenario. So we would use some combination of sort of rescoping and potentially delaying projects, but then do some bonding to help.
So here's where I have a hard time. You're using too much abbreviation. No additional bonds. It's bond sales you're talking about.
Mhm.
That's so.
I don't understand what that means, I guess.
So in scenario one, there are no additional bond sales. We
I know,
just keep using the MISTIP cash in, cash out, pay as you go.
So why is there example bonds, 30 million bonds per year over 2 years? Why is that down there as an example?
Oh, that goes back to the bonding cost sharing, the second row. So all of the scenarios assume some bonding.
Remember for those UGB expansion areas, that's also what's missing. That was the
I see,
purpose
right.
of the bond cost sharing was just for those special UGB expansion areas from 2015 or 15, I think.
Yeah, there was a series of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
So in order to do that, what they bonded was for those UGB expansion areas, there will be additional MISTIF revenue coming through. So they did a 5-year revenue bond sale for it's that tranche. But it's taken more time to build out that initial list. Remember all the presentations that Joe and Stephen have come to with the status of that UGB expansion list. It's just like with the North Bethany list. We've been whittling it away, but there's still some more. And now they cost more. Bummer, dude.
Yeah.
Scenario 2 is, so what's scenario 2 doing different?
So it uses sort of a hybrid approach. So we would do some delaying of projects and rescoping, but also then do an additional bond sale to help not just with the
close.
bonding cost sharing projects, but also to help close the gap. And so in this scenario, we assumed about $60 million of bonding for the bonding cost sharing projects and an additional $60 million for closing the gap.
And this is what Commissioner Rogers was talking about. We should hurry up and do some bonding, take advantage of the lower interest rates. The problem we were encountering at the time is we didn't have solid enough estimates in order to be able to satisfy bond counsel that this is what we would be spending it to.
Since you brought it up,
And now you have it.
I still remember 2% money.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, the costs are gonna go sky high. Not that I'm saying I told you so, but.
You did.
I did.
You did. Yes.
I really, well, I have some questions, very specific questions.
Okay.
When I read this yesterday, I read how you're making your projections, because the economy's gonna go one or two ways. I'm no seer, but I just don't believe it's gonna bump like it is. It's gonna either go down, recessionary period, which we may have, some better pricing, or huge inflation. So this board, in my opinion, needs to make some really interesting decisions. And I'm all for bonding. I would have bonded 60, 70, 80 million bucks, at least, maybe 100, under the premise that we could get some fixed costs out of there. So if we guess wrong, then what's the danger? We could have got it cheaper. If we guess right, we're going to put a lot more projects on that table. So, I mean, I don't know how you're making your projections. I don't know what you're using, some kind of financial calculation internally. I mean, this is kind of heady stuff because you can project all kinds of stuff. I don't know what your inflationary rates you're using, your cost accelerator is, what you're using. I mean, I just, you're pretty graphs and I commend you. A lot of nice work, but I have no idea what's behind any of this.
Yeah, and those are great inputs into helping us refine these scenarios. So these are very high level and very conceptual. So we really wanted to get your feedback on them and questions to help us as we start fleshing these out further. And we'll definitely be bringing them back.
So I'm closer to you, to your thought than you think.
Does that mean I can move over here closer with my cold?
No. Keep it cool. I'm very comfortable with bonding to maximum funding level to satisfy bond council. Okay, but in order for that, for our staff to go through and do the work, they have to satisfy bond council. And that's where I felt that I understood that they didn't think they had enough information ready in order to satisfy bond council. And so, to put it in my words, you're not there yet. Please get there very soon and bond away.
Yeah.
Or what do we need to do to help you get there?
Right. Yes, and to Commissioner Rogers' point, obviously, had we bonded a couple of years ago, the rates were great. That would have been ideal. You know, as you say, the stars didn't quite align for us at that time, and so. But as we flesh these out, yes, we'll be asking a lot of those, working through a lot of those same points. I think that you're raising, Commissioner, that we need to work through and understand a little bit more what the implications of some of those key factors would be on how these scenarios actually could play out over time.
And what it means for repayment source.
Mhm. Right.
What's the bond interest rate right now? Have you looked at that?
No,
So we-
again, these are very conceptual and we would come back with scenarios.
I'm hearing 4% or better versus 2.
Well, so what I'm trying to follow up on your comment about, are we going into inflationary times? We're going into recession times? And what's the pros and cons of both ways? So we bond at a 5% rate today and we go into a recession where the bond rate actually comes down. So we've paid more money for the bonding over the next umpteen years to do that. Okay. And at the same time, been able to maybe benefit from that recessionary period to get construction costs down and we have money. Okay. So what's the contrast of that versus the other direction? We bond here, the inflation things go up. Now we have money, but projects cost more money. So do we even want to do them during that period of time? I'm more of the mindset of we tap the brakes just a little bit right now and we let to see which way, because I'm hearing costs are starting to settle. So I'd say we just kind of be patient on what it is that we're doing for, you know, not for another year or two, but certainly I think we'll see some of this maybe even as we go into wonderful times, presidential elections in 24.
Can I
So-
pause here though? Because what we're getting a little lost in the weeds because we don't need to, we shouldn't be deciding when they execute the sale.
Why
Okay.
not?
Uh,
I mean, isn't that kind of, I mean, we can work with them
No.
and we can certainly go to pond council and everybody else and say, is this the best time? But let's talk about
bond council will work with our staff on the timing, whether you do it this week or you do it 3 months from now. Okay. What our job is to do, I believe from reading the materials and whatnot, is we need to decide the level of completeness and commitment that we're comfortable with. Okay, for figuring out the dollars and cents. For example, if we go with scenario 3, cover the known gap today. There's a lot of advantages to that. We commit to the list, we know what it is, so on and so forth. But what we then lose is, what about Southwest Corridor? Should there ever be a regional program and we have to use right now, the only cash we have for a local match for any new program, whether it's regional or through the state, it is misstep, right? So if we go for scenario 3 with a full gap, we need to hear the estimates of how long of a capture of misstep revenue might that be. Okay. That's the difference between scenario 2 and scenario 3. And in doing so, it's all about what level of gap we want to deal with right now so that we have flexibility, because we never can predict from one 5-year cycle to the next if the state's going to have a new program, a new transportation program across the state, or if the feds are. And it really comes down to figuring that out and laying it all out.
Lots of variables.
Yep.
Or if I can suggest maybe advancing to the next slide, to the next steps, because really what we're asking your board is to come back in October. So Stephen, if you want to move forward to the next slide, because many of you have had several questions, and the additional information and work staff would do would be aimed at addressing those questions on scenarios and bonding.
Yep. And I'll just say, Commissioner, one of the reasons that we were thinking about maybe sequencing a series of smaller bond sales rather than one large sale, there's obviously the sort of spend down requirements or obligations that would come with those, but also given that we are in a somewhat uncertain environment right now, if the interest rates, the bond rates drop over time, we are committing ourselves to less money at a higher rate and then can take advantage of lower rates in the future. If things are at a higher rate, well, we just have to sort of evaluate each time before we would ask to move forward with another bond sale.
And they also cost money.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct. Right. Lots of trade-offs. So yeah, thank you, Ms. Angie. I think as we're talking about now getting some feedback from the board, and this has been excellent. We appreciate that. And as we move forward, we'll be coming back hopefully in October. We'll have enough time to pull together some additional detail on these different scenarios that we'll bring back to you for further discussion and review. And then again, just thinking about some of the things that we've touched on here. What are the implications of this on cash flow over time? As Rachel was just alluding to, if we bond, we have to have a source of funds to repay that debt over time. And the debt scenarios, the payback scenarios can vary significantly. So, and then I think we'll just need to flesh those out and bring those back to you for further discussion. And again, just a reminder.
Where does WCCC come into this?
Next Monday.
I mean, when do they weigh in on these kinds of things, make recommendations, and
yeah, I'll maybe
ultimate decision comes to us. But
yes, I'll come back to that maybe here in just a minute too.
Sorry, I didn't mean to get ahead.
No.
Get the same
Great question.
material and presentation next Monday.
Mhm.
And I think we need to talk about this a little bit because there's a couple of things missing.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So, and again, I think as we're talking about these different funding scenarios, we will continue to try to refine some assumptions about, different funding sources that might play into those scenarios too. So a couple of next steps near term that later this week, I'll be briefing city managers. We've had conversations about this topic with WCCC members over the last couple of months, fairly brief and informal, but just updates along the way. We've had a lot of discussions with city staff members, but we had not really been speaking directly to the city manager level. So we think that's a good opportunity to just kind of make sure that the city managers are up to speed about where things are at and where we think we're going.
Stephen, can I interject there? I think part of that reality is because staff are making more requests to the city or to the county for additional funds because the shortages that they're having in their transportation projects. So talking about just transportation and infrastructure holistically with the city managers and in that shared space that we are all facing this cost escalation factor together.
Right. And I know they've been having some similar discussions with Lisa Tattersall and libraries around WCCLS, another one of those sort of legacy general fund transfer programs. And so, right. And other needs. Exactly. And then, Commissioner, to your question, we will be providing this update essentially to the WCCC next Monday as well. And building on prior conversations that we've had with them back in February and a couple of brief updates over the summer. But to your question about their role in this, we envision continue to have a role in terms of forming recommendations for your board to consider in terms of how to evaluate the project priorities on the major road and street network. So something similar to the process that we've had with MSTIP carrying forward for those kinds of projects that would be reliant on those general funding sources that come from those countywide revenues.
So I'm just going to start. There's a couple things missing from this graphic for me, because you're asking us every single month to come back to this topic. Big gulp. So the Board of Commissioners needs to be in the September box, okay? So that you then have a replicable model for each of those subsequent steps. Then the other thing that's missing from this timeline is we all need to have a common understanding of the MISTIP 3D, 3E list. And given the current cost estimates of how it goes out over time. And if you want us to just be satisfied with the graphs, the 3-color graphs that are used from the other slides, okay, that's fine. But I think it's pivotal to recognize, check, that because those projects have been approved previously. But if you want us to have to weigh in for rescoping,
right,
then that needs to be clearly said.
Yep.
Right? We need to know when will that check happen? Then there's the MISTIP 23 to 28 list. You know what I've learned now is I was so very wrong to suggest that we move to a year sequence, a 5-year sequence from the letter number. It's still a relatable problem,
right?
But boy, I get it. Sorry. Then I'm an elected official. I don't live and breathe this transportation stuff every single week and month like you do. So you're losing me a little bit. It was back to the funding gaps and where we have some plausible choices to make and not the pros, cons, but what are the benefits and what are the risks, right? That we already talked about earlier. You go from talking to us and at us about MISTIP, and now all of a sudden you're dealing with a wider road network. So you're losing me here, right? Because you go from talking about MISTIP to then talking about the other street and whatever network you talked about. And I'm like, okay, it's not the same thing each month. It's a different level of the process. So that's what I'm having a hard time with here.
Yep, that's good feedback.
And, it could still be that you're talking about, okay, there's a bullet list here or something. There's a list down here. And some of these relate to MISTIP and some of them relate to a wider network.
Yeah, put
The
it into
holistic
context of
system,
all of
right.
the
Yeah,
funding sources
right.
and
There's
all
a
of the
whole
projects.
system
Yep.
and then there are those things that are funded by MISTIP versus other sources. Right? Just,
Yep,
Mhm.
that's great feedback. We can incorporate that broader look.
so, for your meeting on Monday, this is where I was concerned about that word remove. But also this whole conversation about when to do bonding and how much to bond for. You're gonna lose people. I mean, there's only 5 of us here. You're gonna have 30 of them, up to 30 around that table, and it's gonna be a Zoom table. And good luck.
Yeah.
So, and I think we got through pretty fast in terms of there are certain limits to bonding and there are things you get, right? Certainty on what you're going to build, but there are the gives and the gets, right? So we lose flexibility and we don't know what will happen at that federal and state other programs out in the future. And so are we going to be satisfied? Will future boards be satisfied that they won't be able to go after those grants because they won't have the local match?
Yeah, I don't think the presentation really captures some of the potential trade-offs
Mhm.
in decisions related to either bonding or how we fund and finance going forward that we can certainly bring back in the future. I think that's really important, and it does not capture that.
Yeah, because knowing what that assemblage of folks in, they're going to want you to build all their projects now without costing them more money. Just do it. And here we are, comparatively down in the details, when they're only really about our level of approvals.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I think my intention was to just be sure that we're sharing a consistent set of information with all of our elected officials. And so trying, as you say, not to get bogged down in all those details, but to be sure they know that we're having those kinds of conversations with the board was really our intention. So we just want to make sure that we're not sharing different bits and pieces of things that are, but yeah, that's a really relevant point. So I appreciate the insights and the context for that. And then we'll definitely work on making sure that we're a little bit more clear about the various aspects of this work. And we're also working to flesh out a little bit more detailed overview of the CIP process as we move through that. So we'll continue to refine this work that you see today.
I think Stephen, one of the things, I don't know if you'll bring it up on Monday when I was looking at the scenarios, sorry, my computer's upstairs. I didn't have time to go grab, so I'm on my iPhone, but it's pretty big. I can see the whole thing. I'm okay. Thank you. Yeah, this one, the cost sharing scenarios. I had the same thought the chair did around like, oh yeah, let's go with scenario number 3, which I don't think you went through, but I appreciate the chair bubbling that up. But it was a really enlightening, some of the stuff the chair shared around like what other projects, commitments out there that will be impacted if we do go with the scenario number 3 to say, let's just go all in on. So are you gonna bubble that up? Because I know some of the members on WCC are both did the tour for the metro tour for the West Side, and there are many of them are quite active for the TV Highway Steering Committee. So there's a commitment on that. So are you gonna bubble some of that conversation about what would potentially be impacted? Because I didn't think about the points the chair brought in terms of big commitments out there that will be impacted if we do bond. And then the question, I had just one question about the city funding contributions. And then I heard Tanya raise add some points to that. Is this going to be a conversation at WCCC, and are you going to unpack that bullet point?
Mhm.
Because I think there needs to be impact and a bit of a more context.
I'm lost. Yeah, I'm not.
So what does it mean? What did you mean on that bullet point?
Yeah. So related to city funding
Yeah.
shares. Yeah.
You
So,
mentioned
so sort of
conversation
implementing
with
something like the funding
managers.
cost sharing approach
Oh.
in future,
Yeah.
in future transportation capital projects. So if we're committing a large chunk of county funding, do we ask our city partners to also contribute financially? So sort of replicating the model of the bonding cost sharing program where we had a 2/3, 1/3 cost share for that program with the cities in the county.
And then
Have at least four mayors at the WCCC table that weren't at the table when you define that set. And I don't know when the last time, I know we've had at least twice in the last 5 years, the update about the status of those UGB expansion bond cost sharing projects, right? Primarily with regard to some South Hillsborough projects,
We got some for
Mhm.
Tualatin with Basalt Creek.
Uh,
Yeah, I
yeah, it
can
was really-
remember.
yeah, we
when-
had-
Basalt Creek.
No.
You might want to put that list and that last status, not current status, but the last one you presented and date it that way and put it into an updated packet for Monday. Because it's just for that row of projects where the cities have accepted, it was like 50-50, MISTIP or something. MISTIP would only carry 50% of the cost and the cities had to carry 50% of the cost versus a standard MISTIP project where MISTIP carries the cost.
Right. Yeah, we did about a 2/3, 1/3 split for those
There you go.
for those projects. Yeah.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
Was that through their TDT? Is that where they got the money?
The cities got to decide how they wanted to bring their share to the table. So it could be TDT, could be there. A lot of the new development areas have supplemental system development charges. So some combination of those other
General fund.
sources.
Yeah, it was city money, period.
Mhm.
It's what they controlled.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that feedback too.
So I guess, are we gonna expect that, if it's a 2/3, 1/3, are we gonna expect that moving ahead into the next backfilling of projects that are now underwater? We're gonna go back to the cities and say, remember, this was 2/3, 1/3, so 1/3's on you?
No, that wasn't the deal at the time. We committed those, or the board approved those project lists. They were just going to be MSTIP funded. So we are having conversations with the cities about those existing projects and just saying, is there an opportunity for the city to bring some funding to this?
Yes.
Just realizing that we have a gap, and are there opportunities for us to share some of that additional costs? So those are more ad hoc discussions that we've been having.
Will we ever be finalizing a MISTIP 23-28 list?
I don't think so. I think we're wanting to use that work that we did, but I really view us having a comprehensive transportation CIP program, and that will identify a slate of projects and the various funding sources that are used in order to deliver those projects. So,
Whoa. The cities have liked 3D, 3E because they know what projects are going to get built through the community. And we're going to have to keep. So there's the TSP, which has all kinds of visions, and then there are the project lists. So I don't have a problem with saying, okay, we've end of life the work in progress MISTIP 23-28 list, but we haven't approved anything beyond 3E.
correct.
So what are you telling me we're going to be approving between now and the end of 26,
So I think,
or at least 24.
yeah, so I think our vision really is that as opposed to making a specific MSTIP funding decision and allocation, we're really we're looking at our broader list of transportation needs, and those all get adopted into the CIP. And that's, again, that 5-year forward-looking plan for projects that would be coming up or started during that upcoming 5-year cycle, as opposed to having a discrete MSTIP project list.
Well, one of the nice things at an elected level about having an agreed upon set of MISTIP projects is, yeah, Commissioner Tree said it. You get the fighting over with, and then you've got another 4 years to do real work other than MISTIP. And
Yeah, I think Stephen is saying incorporating that city input priorities into the
yearly
comprehensive.
CIP list.
That's right. And well, on a
No,
on a 5-year
no.
basis.
It's a 5-year basis.
5-year basis, choosing it and then looking at it every year. So we
The
can,
board's going to look at it every year because it relates
Right.
to our budget.
yes.
We don't want to have to fight with mayors all 13 mayors.
That's not what, yeah, we're suggesting doing all of that work, the 5-year on a 5-year schedule.
So we'd have,
Similar to what happens.
okay.
Yeah.
So we'd have the list.
Yeah.
There would be agreed upon list.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yep.
There will be a list. of projects
There must be
saying-
rules
Correct.
about what, any changes to the list.
Right.
So there'd have to be some guidelines that goes
Mhm.
along with that type of process.
Yes.
There is a list. No, that's,
There's a 5-year list.
there will be. a
List.
list.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
There is a
And then
5-year
it
list.
just has some sequence
Yes,
detail.
the 5-year list gets sequenced into an annual capital improvement plan.
And built out over those subsequent years.
So if we're
Rachel
seeing
talked about
cost
earlier.
escalation, your board sees cost. We look at the projects each year, but you're basing it on that 5-year list.
And your
Okay.
next 5-year list may be shorter because of the cost escalation.
Or because of projects you didn't, that are carried over from the previous list.
So what we're trying to figure out is there's a 3D and a 3E list with a $90 million gap of list. And we're trying to figure out, is that all we're going to be focusing on for getting into a CIP? And
Yeah.
getting constructed, or is there ever going to be another new projects for a 5-year list?
Yes, and I think this is actually on the.
Oh, yeah.
On the actually the last slide. So the answer is yes. I'm sorry, up above,
Sorry.
Just give her the clicker.
Okay.
right there.
There we go.
So,
It'll be too
So-
easy.
So, Chair, yes, the board does need to, or at some point, we would recommend looking at those future projects. The purpose of coming today is really to talk about some options for closing that funding gap. And the decisions, like, as you were just talking about, the decisions that are made around the funding gap will have implications for the future. And what we've heard loud and clear is that you need some idea of what that future looks like so that to inform your decisions around the gap funding.
Yep, so the gap funding is, in this arrow diagram, will be the topic focus between September and October, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I still don't know how far out in time, if we're ever going to get to a new 5-year list, or if that list, well, earlier you said we do need to work on a new list
Mhm.
because we need to
Right.
build the pipeline.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I apologize. I think
So that's where you
So
lose
Be
in
me.
more
spirit-
articulate,
In
yeah.
spirit of time, do I hear that as an outstanding question for clarity in the October presentation? Chair, you're asking for, how does the MISTIP list the 5-year commitment list get integrated into the capital improvement planning process. We've also shared we would further flush out the scenarios, come back with that information, and also the listing of the previous misstep issuance, what's still outstanding from a project list.
I agree. But what I believe I'm headed for is you're gonna have that meeting on Monday, and I'm gonna have my monthly chair mayor's meeting a couple of days later, and it's gonna be really messy. And September and October is gonna be, there's gonna be some heightened conversations locally that I didn't have on my radar screen until today's work session. Because it's just not clear enough yet.
Right.
That's all. It's progress. I understand how you're working towards it and that it'll get fleshed out through the remainder of the year. I just didn't quite have the messiness on my radar.
Couple of comments, and a couple that you might be planning on answering. One, the bond rates, I just looked them up. They're about 3.4 to 4.25. That's what they're averaging, depending on length of time you go. So 4%, that's what we're looking at. Goldman Sachs is saying 85% chance of no sort of recession. If I could get up to bat and get an 85% of a hit, I'm happy. So I'll go with them.
That's a good odds.
That means that things are going not in a recessionary period, probably forward. Feds are trying to get 2%. We hear that all the time. They're not going to get that. They're going to get about 2.5. So over a 3-year period, you're going to be about 7.5% to 8% up on cost. So yeah, none of these can be queued. Even if we said these are our 5-year projects, somebody's got to be last. And so your project cost is going to be 2.5, 2.5, 2.5, 2.5. So they're going to be way up. So that's the problem you're dealing with. The questions that I would suspect that the mayors would ask, because they always ask me this. One, if they weren't fortunate enough to be queued correctly, they were playing the game. We'll be good people. You go ahead with your project. Mine will come later. How many of those didn't get included? Whose ox is getting gored? So that we're not terribly surprised. I mean, I don't know anymore, but I mean, it did at the time. Somebody's going to say, you guys are really not very kind. When my turn came up to bat, it took me out of the game. So we need to know that issue. We've got to be really careful on the 1/3, kind of 2/3, because some would say, well, that applies to county projects, we're incorporated. So you ought to kick in 1/3. That means there's more in the pot for the rest of us.
No, we don't have any more UUA expansion areas.
I know, but that was what they used to say. Any kind of a misstep project that was on any major street within the urban growth boundary, you ought to kick in. I'd say no, and we're not doing that. But that, just so that you're prepared, that might be what they'll ask about.
And we would anticipate doing that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Another one that they'll ask about is the opportunity fund, because we did that because it was super important. Is any of the bonding, if the bonding's only for the catch-up, it's not an issue. If bonding is going to be all of the projects that we're doing, they're going to say, well, what's the money for the opportunity fund?
Mhm.
Because that's really, really important to them. And that, frankly, was really good for us because they would throw in a bunch of money. It's a great program. So just be prepared. If I were the chair walking into a meeting, I would kind of want to know a little bit of your thoughts on that.
Mhm.
So I didn't get pummeled and say, well, where'd all that come from? Yeah. But I know that that's their issues.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner. That's also helpful as we think about the scenarios that we'll bring back to this board. So thank you.
I think you have enough to go on today to start scoping out what you need and what a scenario 2 looks like.
Yep.
And potentially a difference between a scenario 2 and a scenario 3.
Yep.
But we know you're gonna have to go out for another bond sale for at least the bond cost sharing. So why not also prepare for some of the gap funding? And as you work on those details, then we have to come back to talk about that anyway. So then we have the opportunity to refine what are the gives and the gets. We're not actually oxing anybody's gore or
Pouring any.
goring anybody's eyes.
I like yours though. I'll see it there.
Because the list is still the list. We're still building the list. We're still committed to the list. It's just a matter of the readiness and having the money to pay for it. So,
I agree. I agree. And it's important to re-emphasize,
I mean,
especially,
there's still sensitivity,
yeah,
right? Because
Well, there
we're
will
so
be.
far behind.
especially with the small cities, they couldn't come up with their match. And so they said, well, that's okay for a Hillsborough or Beaverton or Tiger or something like that. What do we do for a King City or a Durham or Banks? You know, and
The same thing we're doing for the UUAs. Stuck in your belt and figure it out, and it hurts.
but they're seeing their neighbors getting something and they're not. So we just have to have a message.
We always envy the big guys.
Yeah. Like that.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the insights too, and I appreciate the insights in thinking about being as articulate as we can be about how all of these various threads are going to tie together. So thank you.
You've laid out a lot, and we're all on the train with you.
Yep. Well,
Chair,
appreciate
can
that.
I just take a moment and express appreciation to staff, both Stephen, well, Rachel too, but you're interim, right? Convince you any longer. But Stephen, seriously, for your leadership and the team, I see Russ here, I see Jessica here, I see Joe here, just the great work that they've done to put this together. So huge appreciation to the transportation team. Oh, Aaron Wardell's back.
Yeah.
Heidi.
Yeah, no, this is great. I mean, this is really helpful talking through these, helps us, I think, to clarify our own thinking and help us move forward in a good direction. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Do we have any late breaking things that has to be summarized before we call it a day? No, 1, 2, 3, go, we're adjourned.
Even it could be worse. You could have just spent $85 million on a quarterback guarantee.